Somewhere in Paris right now, a government employee is watching the little Windows logo flicker off their screen for the very last time, and they have no idea they're witnessing the opening move of the biggest digital divorce in the history of Western government. Because on April the 8th, 2026, inside a closed-door meeting most French citizens will never hear about, someone in the French government stood up and said something no major Western democracy has ever said out loud and actually meant it. Rip it all out, every ministry, every desk, every one of the 2.5 million machines running Microsoft Windows across the French state, and by autumn, we want a plan for how you're getting off American software entirely, not eventually, not when the budget allows, not another committee report that dies quietly in a drawer, but now. And what makes this story different from every failed attempt before, it is buried in a detail almost nobody outside French IT circles has ever heard of. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why this time might actually be the time it works. Let's start with what the directive really demanded, because France drops Windows barely scratches the surface of what happened that morning. The order, issued by France's Interministerial Digital Directorate, DINUM, didn't just target desktop operating systems. It carved the entire technological body of the French state into 8 separate organs and demanded a transplant plan for each one. Workstations, communication platforms, security software, artificial intelligence systems, databases, cloud infrastructure, and the network hardware running underneath all of it. This wasn't a memo about which logo appears when you boot up your laptop. This was a government looking at its own nervous system and admitting, in public, that it didn't own it. The minister who delivered the message, David Amiel, didn't hide behind soft diplomatic language either. He said plainly that France could no longer accept a country that doesn't control its own data or its own digital infrastructure. And if you sit with that sentence for a second, it's a stunning admission from a G7 government that for decades, the day machinery of French administration had been quietly running on foreign rails, and nobody had seriously questioned it because dependency, when it happens slowly enough, stops looking like a risk and starts looking like normal life. So why did the alarm finally go off in 2026? Here's the number that should make you sit up. American cloud providers currently control roughly 85% of the entire European cloud market. 85%? That means the overwhelming majority of European government and business data ultimately answers, in some legal sense, to infrastructure sitting under American jurisdiction rather than European law. And buried inside that fact is a piece of legislation most people have never heard of called the Cloud Act, which in certain circumstances allows American authorities to compel American companies to hand over data even when the servers physically sit on European soil. Nobody knows for certain how often that power actually gets used against European government data. Legal scholars argue about it constantly. But here's the uncomfortable truth Paris finally faced. You cannot build a national security strategy on the hope that a risk probably won't materialize. Once officials genuinely internalized that even a small probability of foreign legal exposure was unacceptable for the machinery running an entire country, this stopped being a spreadsheet exercise and became something closer to a matter of principle. And principles, unlike cost-saving initiatives, tend to survive the budget overruns and technical disasters that kill most ambitious tech migrations. Now here's the part of the story that almost nobody talks about, and it's the reason France is attempting something every other Western government has quietly failed at. France isn't walking into this blind. It has spent the last 20 years running a live, full-scale experiment inside its own borders, and it's been sitting there so quietly that most of the country forgot it was even happening. Back in 2004, France's national police force, the gendarmerie, began a careful, almost invisible transition away from American software. First, they swapped Internet Explorer for Firefox, then Microsoft Office for OpenOffice, then Outlook for Thunderbird. Small, boring, unremarkable decisions, one at a time, giving officers and technicians years to build comfort before anyone touched anything fundamental. Then, in 2008, they took the leap nobody expected. A customized Linux operating system built specifically for police work, nicknamed Genbuntu. That system has now been quietly running on more than 100,000 police computers for almost 2 decades, filing reports, managing sensitive investigations, and holding together the daily operations of one of the largest law enforcement agencies in Europe without a single Microsoft product anywhere inside it. There's no headline attached to most of that, and that's exactly the point. A migration succeeds the moment it stops being interesting enough to write about. And that 20-year proof of concept is the single biggest reason officials in Paris believe this attempt will succeed where so many others collapsed, because they're not pointing to some foreign case study in Scandinavia and hoping for the best. They're pointing at their own police force and saying, we've already done this with our own people for 2 decades. And it worked. But before you get swept up in the optimism, you need to understand the ghost hanging over every single government official signing off on this plan, because it has a name, and that name is Munich. Back in the early 2000s, the city of Munich, Germany launched its own ambitious Linux migration called LiMux. And for years, it was held up worldwide as proof a major city could break free from Microsoft. And then, slowly and painfully, it fell apart. Political leadership changed hands, and the new administration cared less about the vision than the old one did. Microsoft's lobbying intensified the moment it smelled political weakness. And critically, Munich tried to move everything at once: the operating system, the Office suite, dozens of specialized applications, without the patient and decades-long groundwork the gendarmerie had quietly been laying in France. When enough frustrated department heads complained loudly enough, reversing course became easier than fighting for the vision. And Munich went back to Windows, becoming the cautionary tale every skeptic still reaches for whenever a government dares to announce something like this. France's answer to that ghost is simple: remember the gendarmerie instead. DINUM has explicitly cited the police force's slow, incremental model as the governance blueprint for the entire national rollout, which tells you something important. This government actually studied its own history instead of copying a slogan from Brussels. So what's actually replacing Windows? Here's where it gets honest rather than triumphant, because the answer is it's not fully decided yet. No single Linux distribution has been named for the national rollout, and each ministry keeps flexibility to choose its own path inside the broader framework. Though most analysts expect something built on Ubuntu, Debian, or Fedora to dominate, given 20 years of institutional muscle memory with Ubuntu-based systems inside the police force. But the operating system, brutally, is the easy half of this story. The half that actually kills migrations like this is software, the applications people use every single hour of every single day. And that's why France built something called Suite Numérique, a homegrown productivity ecosystem developed entirely under DINUM's control. Document editing, spreadsheets, email, file storage, internal messaging, every piece of it built and hosted entirely inside French and European jurisdiction. It's slower and more expensive to build your own alternative from scratch than to license a polished commercial product. But it buys something no contract with a foreign company could ever guarantee: actual control. And this wasn't even the government's first move. Back in January 2026, months before the Windows announcement, France had already declared it would strip Microsoft Teams and Zoom out of government entirely, migrating 2.5 million civil servants onto a homegrown video platform called Visio, with a completion target of 2027. Look at the sequence, and a pattern jumps out immediately. Communication tools first, then the operating system underneath everything, the exact same order the gendarmerie followed 2 decades earlier: browser, then Office software, then communication, and only then, once confidence had actually been earned, the operating system itself. But let's not pretend this has been smooth, because pretending would be dishonest, and the cracks are real. Visio currently caps meetings at 150 participants. Microsoft Teams supports up to 10,000. For a small departmental meeting, that gap means nothing. For a major cross-ministry briefing, it's a genuine wall, and DINUM hasn't given a public date for when, or if, that ceiling rises. And underneath the surface sits an even harder problem: specialized legacy software, tax collection systems, financial regulation platforms, healthcare records, infrastructure control systems, software written decades ago, patched 1,000 times since, fully understood by only a handful of remaining engineers, and quietly, invisibly dependent on Windows system libraries that exist nowhere else on Earth. Untangling that kind of dependency without breaking a system millions of citizens rely on for their tax refunds or their benefit payments isn't a weekend project. Even the most optimistic analysts covering this migration admit full deployment across every corner of French government likely won't be finished until sometime in the early 2030s. Let's talk about what this actually costs, because the number is staggering. France hasn't released an official total, but independent estimates place the full migration somewhere between 1.5 billion and 3 billion euros, spread across a 5 to 7 year rollout, covering hardware, software development, staff retraining across the entire civil service, and the ongoing technical support needed to keep it all running. Against that number, DINUM points to something the gendarmerie has already proven in the real world. Its Linux deployment reportedly cut total cost of ownership by roughly 40% compared to its old Windows licensing model, saving somewhere around 2 million euros a year indefinitely once transition costs were absorbed. Multiply that across 2.5 million machines, and the eye-watering upfront bill starts to look less like recklessness and more like a long-term bet placed with actual evidence behind it. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. It's one visible piece of a much larger continental shift. European privacy regulators have levied roughly 7.1 billion euros in cumulative GDPR fines by the start of 2026, a meaningful share of them tied directly to cases where European data flowed through foreign-controlled infrastructure in ways that violated European privacy law. French cloud providers like OVH Cloud and Scaleway have reported record client growth since early 2025, as European institutions of every kind quietly start pulling workloads off American infrastructure. Germany already ran its own smaller version of this exact experiment. Back in 2024, the state of Schleswig-Holstein began migrating tens of thousands of workstations to Linux and LibreOffice after 2 years of careful piloting, following almost exactly the same cautious playbook. It's a single German state, nowhere near France's national scale, but it proves the underlying approach isn't uniquely French. It's becoming a European pattern, and every government watching is quietly taking notes. So, what happens now that the directive is actually live? DINUM itself, a lean agency of around 250 people, is serving as the very first real-world test case, migrating its own offices to Linux immediately, essentially turning itself into a live laboratory before asking a single other ministry to follow. Every other ministry, agency, and public operator across the French state now has until autumn 2026 to submit a formal implementation roadmap. And here's the detail almost every headline about this story gets wrong. That autumn deadline is for a plan, not for completion. It's the moment ministries have to show their homework, not the moment every government computer finishes switching over. Full national deployment, given the sheer weight of legacy software and staff retraining, is genuinely expected to stretch into the early 2030s before it's truly finished. And Microsoft, understandably, has every reason to be nervous because its entire European government business was built over decades on one simple, powerful truth. Switching an enormous organization off Windows is difficult enough, expensive enough, and risky enough that almost nobody ever seriously tried it. France just publicly proved that inertia can be broken, given enough political will, a credible internal precedent, and a clear strategic reason. And if this migration succeeds, even partially, it removes the single biggest argument every other hesitant European government has used for staying exactly where they are. It proves the switch is survivable. Now stretch this out to the horizon, because this is where the story stops being about operating systems entirely and starts being about something much bigger. For decades, the unspoken assumption inside almost every government and corporation on Earth was that switching costs were simply too high to seriously walk away from dominant American software. An assumption so deeply embedded that it shaped procurement decisions and IT budgets for a generation without anyone seriously questioning it. France just tested that assumption at national scale, backed not by ideology, but by 20 quiet years of internal evidence from its own police force, and that test alone forces every other government watching to ask an uncomfortable question. Has our own dependency ever actually been examined this closely, or did it simply become invisible the same way it did in France? One contract, one convenience, one decade at a time? And here's the detail that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. This entire national transformation, 2.5 million machines, billions of euros, the biggest technology break in modern European government history, traces its origin back to a handful of police officers in 2004 quietly swapping one web browser for another, a decision so small and unremarkable that literally nobody outside French law enforcement noticed it happening. Nobody watching that quiet, boring decision back then could have predicted it would become the exact blueprint for one of the most consequential government technology experiments of this entire decade. That's usually how the biggest shifts in the world actually happen. Not with an announcement, not with a headline, but quietly, patiently for 20 years, until suddenly, all at once, they don't look quiet anymore. Right now, in real time, we're watching one of the largest and most consequential technology bets any Western government has placed in a generation, and whether it becomes the template the rest of Europe finally follows, or the next Munich cautionary tale skeptics cite for the next 20 years, depends entirely on what happens next. Quietly, inside ministry offices, most of us will never see, one migrated computer at a time. And we'll be right here when those autumn plans finally land, breaking down exactly what they reveal,